Right, everyone. Good morning and happy Friday. Thank you so much for joining Advocates for Ohio's Future, a budget webinar series here in our last installment for February. Excited for the new month ahead of us. Wanted to first share just a couple housekeeping issues. Please submit any and all questions through the chat box, also through the Q&A system. I'll be monitoring those throughout the webinar today. We will be holding questions until the end, and if we have more questions than we can get to, we will, of course, send those to our presenters and post them on our website later today. This webinar is being recorded, and all slides and the full recording of the webinar will be available at advocatesforohio.org/webinars. I wanted to give two brief updates from our webinar 2 weeks ago concerning Senate Bill 17. I wanted to let them know that the bill was heard for opponent and interested party testimony this past week. We had 51 individuals and organizations submit testimony as either opponents or interested parties. We had 11 folks testify in person on the bill, which is a fantastic showing of advocacy. Making sure that our elected leaders know how important programs like SNAP, Medicaid, and unemployment insurance are. And we will continue to make sure that provisions that like those included in Senate Bill 17 hopefully do not make it successfully through the legislative process, and continuing to sound that drum. So thank you for your advocacy. Also wanted to, and this bill will not be heard for a hearing next week. So we are continuing to talk to legislators about the bill over the next week. Also wanted to give folks a heads up. We know that the budget process is in full swing in House Finance Committee now in the subcommittee process. We know that agency directors are testifying before subcommittees this last week and moving forward into next week. I wanted to let you know that given the times, the process is a bit different than budgets in past. Normally, we would see agency directors testify in the subcommittee hearings, and then there would be followed by a week or two of public testimony only, a lot of panels and such. We've learned that will not be the process this time. And if you are interested in submitting public testimony in any of the House subcommittees, next week may be the last week to do so. I know we've been coordinating and in communication with Representative Romer's office, who is the chair of the House Health and Human Services Budget Subcommittee, to make sure that we get that testimony in on time for submission and consideration by the full committee. So just wanted to give you a heads up, but we know that that process was a little bit unclear. Happy to answer some questions about that as well, if you have any in the chat. With that being said, let's get to the good stuff. Really excited about our subject today. Excited to have two Advocates for Ohio's Future members, our co-chair, and Scott Britton with us. So Tara Britton will join us first. She is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Center for Community Solutions. And then later we will have Scott Britton, we know what you're thinking, no relation, joining us as the Assistant Director of the Public Children's Services Association of Ohio, talking to us about that Public Children's Services line items and what's happening in the budget. So I will hand things off to Tara, and please begin whenever you're ready.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. Thank you for the invitation to join today. I am going to spend just a little bit of time talking about multi-system youth. I will start with a definition, so we'll get into that in a moment, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the work that has been done in this space up to this point, and just kind of how we've laid the groundwork for where we are now as it relates to helping kids with multiple complex needs that kind of engage with lots of systems across the state. So we can go ahead and get started. Thanks, Kelsey. Multi-system youth are youth that are, so these are children and teenagers ranging from, very young children all the way through up until high school. Although once I get further into the slides, we're talking about kids a little bit older than high school age. These children have needs that can't be met by a single state department or local, sort of the local arm of the state department. These children often have two or more significant challenges, including physical or mental illness, a substance use issue, a developmental disability, severe trauma. We know the impact of the sort of adverse childhood experiences for kids in that fall into this multi-system youth category is definitely profound. They're involved or at risk of becoming involved with other state agencies, including child protection or the juvenile justice system services, really where kind of all of this, the issue really speaks to all of us, and what we're trying to get at is because these systems and these services are often not coordinated. That's not true everywhere in the state. There are amazing services, amazing agencies around the state that do a great job at helping children and families in many communities, but I think it's the typical Ohio story. You know, you hear about one county, it's not the same as the next county over, or you hear about one agency and it's not the same as the next agency over. And so that's something that, you know, this sort of statewide effort around multi-system youth is something we're trying to address. The complex needs of these kids often exhaust the resources of their families and their communities, and there are large gaps in funding and access to care. So we know currently, although we're, you know, part of all of these efforts are to help kids, you know, stay in their home safely with their families as long as possible, hopefully forever. You know, we want to make sure services are available to kids in their communities. We know now there are kids that can't be served in the state of Ohio because we don't have the resources to meet complex needs of you know, certain children. So they've been sent to out-of-home placements, and we're trying to work to stop that. Go ahead to the next slide, Kelsey. Thanks. So one of the things you may have heard about, you know, this is something that is often discussed as it relates to multi-system youth, although it's not, certainly not the only issue as it relates to multi-system youth. In the last state budget, we heard from many parents who were in a really just horrible position of having to, what is called forced custody relinquishment. Their kids, you know, they had exhausted every option with their insurance company. They may have mortgaged their home a second time. They may have lost their car and spent down assets to reach Medicaid eligibility, but it still, you know, wasn't meeting their needs. In that situation, families have tragically been forced to relinquish custody of their children to the child welfare system. And the child welfare system can, you know, plays a very vital, important role in helping connect these kids with services, but this is also very taxing on the child welfare system, as I know Scott will likely touch on in his portion of the presentation. And, you know, I think we can all agree that this is not the best way to meet the needs of those children. So we're trying to work on that. Next slide, Kelsey. So a little bit of background, the Joint Legislative Committee on Multi-System Youth from 2 General Assemblies ago, and then the Multi-System Youth Action Plan was developed out of a requirement and work done in the last General Assembly, looks at a lot of issues as it relates to multi-system youth. So this is very high level, but you know, trying to track data, really getting a number, count of who these kids are is a challenge. Looking at peer supports, we know those play an important role for people as they're navigating services and trying to find the best services for their children. Safety net funding. So this is a place where I'll talk a little bit more about this, but really plays an important role in kind of filling gaps, serving as a safety net. It's right there in the name, because we know that, you know, insurance, private and Medicaid don't cover all of the services that people and kids with complex needs might need. So, you know, having some level of state funding that can help to fill those gaps. High fidelity wraparound sounds like a very wonky term. It's a important service that the state is working to implement through its OhioRISE initiative, which I'll talk a little bit about here in a moment. But really this looks at, you know, how can we best navigate, coordinate those services for a child, and really does wrap things around them so that they're not kind of that they and their families are not having to access services in lots of different ways in lots of different places. The local Family and Children First councils also play an important role in helping to navigate for these families. Again, this is kind of a story where things look different depending on the county and the area of the state that folks live in. Also, we know, these are really complicated cases, and small counties, counties with, not a lot of staff, not a lot of funding for their local councils. Also, we're just trying to make sure that there's, I think, some parity in the way that those function across the state. Congregate care, that's something I mentioned earlier about kids sometimes having to go out of state for services. And this is a place where we want to make sure that the services that kids need are available as close to home as possible. And then I talked a bit about custody relinquishment already. So those are the things that kind of have been the focus of the multi-system youth work over the last few General Assemblies. And in the last state budget, House Bill 166, hard to believe we're on to the next one already. There was, a very robust effort through a lot of coalition work and coordination across lots of stakeholders and state agencies, and a lot of support from the governor, his state agencies. We, connected with legislative champions in both parties, both chambers of the General Assembly to, I think for maybe not the first time, but it has been a while since we saw any sort of dedicated, fairly flexible funding related to multi-system youth as it relates to that sort of gap filling work to help multi-system youth. So there was funding in Medicaid, in developmental disabilities, in job and family services. Not to say that those, there are definitely some strings tied to those, some parameters around how those dollars can be spent, but all in all, they were really dedicated to one, trying to avoid those forced custody relinquishment situations. And, we saw through the funding in the Medicaid budget, there are hundreds of families since those dollars were put in place that have been helped across the state just by having some gap filling dollars to pay for. Sometimes it's respite care. Sometimes it's, a very kind of select type of service in a place where it may not have ever been available had it not been for those dollars. So we're definitely seeing an impact as we head into this next budget. And then I'm going to talk a bit about OhioRISE, but this is something that is in development through the state Medicaid department. So we can move it into that now. Thanks, Kelsey. So OhioRISE is really what I would say it's the sort of robust response from the state in addressing the needs of multi-system youth, because we don't have a great, we don't know the full scope of the number of children who qualify or are categorized as multi-system youth. But we know that Medicaid plays a key role in helping to meet the needs of these kids. So as part of the state's overall rebidding or reprocurement of managed care contracts, they have issued an RFP and are in the process of reviewing applications right now for OhioRISE, which is a specialized Medicaid managed care plan for children and youth with complex health, behavioral, and developmental needs. They're expected to serve between 50 and 60,000 children. This won't go live until right now the plan is January of 2022. I've included some information here around eligibility, and that's sort of the big bucket eligibility. There are a lot of details involved with this program. The state has launched an advisory council around OhioRISE to make sure that, we don't know yet who the managed care plans will be, who that will run the OhioRISE program. So as we go through that process, as we go through the process of implementing the program, it's very, there is a lot of stakeholder involvement. So I think that is something that we're very pleased to see, since so much of this work has been driven by, you know, parents who've experienced these situations with their children, stakeholders across the state who represent the agencies that serve these kids and know that, you know, we're not doing everything we can to be most coordinated. So this is a really big effort, but I will move into, I think the next slide is about the current state budget. I just want to make the case here. These dollars are still very important because OhioRISE, so one thing is it won't launch until January 2022. So we still need state dollars to support that safety net. Those gap filler dollars are still very, very important. I know the funding in the Department of Developmental Disabilities also helps to support respite, which is something that, you know, as we've kind of gone through the last couple of years with the flexible dollars in the Medicaid department, knowing that these families, you know, are constantly navigating complex systems for their children, respite is something that is able to be, the dollars in the Department of Developmental Disabilities budget are able to be spent on. Within the Department of Medicaid, that is a continuation and an increase of the dollars that we saw in the last budget. So the expectation is that those will be spent in much the same way that they have been over the last 2 years. And then I know Scott will likely talk more about this, but there is a component that is earmarked for multi-system youth within the Family and Children's Services line item in Department of Job and Family Services. So I went through that really quickly. I know we're keeping questions till the end, but please submit them in the chat as they come up. And I think hopefully that's a good transition into Children's Services.
Tara, thank you so much for your presentation. And as we switch things over to Scott, there is just one quick question I know for you in the chat from Matthew Dunn. Will OhioRISE be replacing the multi-system youth program that was started last year? And we'll get things switched over here on with the slides.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Kelsey. And that's actually a great question. Definitely more succinct than the way I said it. So thank you, Matthew, for asking it that way. We are not expecting that the multi-system youth program that is, it really is very much tied to those dollars in the Department of Medicaid. The expectation is for that to continue at least through this budget. Those dollars are, like I said, had been increased actually the 2 years, or at least in the proposed budget, they've been increased by a few million dollars each year. I can talk a little bit more about what that process is too at the end if we have time, but in a nutshell, we know that the Department of Medicaid, the Governor's Office of Children's Initiatives, the statewide Family and Children First Council, all of the relevant state agencies come together, I think twice monthly, to review applications to utilize those funds. So that is a very thorough process where we know data is being tracked. We know the services that they're funding through those dollars. And again, with, you know, knowing that OhioRISE will not be launched until January 2022, we certainly need those funds for the first part of this biennium. The expectation, you know, things roll out slowly. I don't think the state expects 60,000 children day one of OhioRISE. And as things move forward, I anticipate that, you know, we will encounter spaces where OhioRISE is still not able to do everything that we need it to do. So, you know, I don't think we have an answer for next budget, but certainly those dollars and that program is critical to continue now.
Tara, thank you so much. And so we move on to our next presenter, as Scott Britton is the Assistant Director at PCSAO, the Public Children's Services Association of Ohio. And we're happy to have you here with us today, Scott. Please take it away when you're ready.
Well, thanks, Kelsey. I want to thank you and Advocates for Ohio's Future for this opportunity today. I also want to acknowledge my long lost cousin, Tara, for this great presentation on two essential issues for children's services, multi-system youth and OhioRISE. And I will touch on those a little bit, but she did a fantastic job of describing the need and the goals of those programs. So 2021 will be a pivotal year for children's services because in October, we will be implementing the Family First Prevention Services Act. That's a federal law that passed back in 2018, and Ohio decided to implement it starting later this year. It really is the most dramatic change to federal child welfare financing in decades. It really flips the script on how children's services, Title IV federal funds have been spent and incentivized states in the past to really use foster care as a way to draw down federal funds. For the first time, all states and jurisdictions will be permitted to use those federal funds instead on the front end to prevent children from coming into foster care and to help stabilize families with evidence-based prevention services like mental health and substance use and parenting education. On the other side of things, it tries to reduce the number of kids we have in congregate care. Tara talked about congregate care issues we have in the state. We don't always have enough placements for children, and so we've had to send some out of state for placing in institutions. And we believe strongly that kids should be growing up in families instead of in institutions. And so it eliminates federal reimbursement for placements in group homes or in residential facilities that don't meet new standards called qualified residential treatment programs. So that is sort of the landscape that we have here in Ohio in the context of this budget. In addition to that, the governor has a number of transformational recommendations that came out of a report issued at the end of last year. And so this is a really just pivotal time for children's services. We have to get this right. It's not just a children's services issue. It's a cross-department, cross-jurisdictional issue that we have this kind of once-in-a-generation opportunity to really change the way that we work with families and children who are in crisis. And so we were very excited to kind of see this budget come out. You may remember that in the last budget, the governor and the General Assembly both invested more in children's services than we had ever seen previously, increasing the state child protection allocation, for example, pretty much doubling it. We saw other investments, like Tara said, in multi-system youth, in things around foster care recruitment and best practices, in technology. And so we were watching this budget very carefully to see what happened. And we were a little surprised when it first came out. If you follow our line item, which is line 523, in the Department of Job and Family Services budget. The original Blue Book information that dropped noted a 58% increase in new children's services funding. That was a little bit of a misnomer, because as we sort of delved into that, we found that, of course, during the pandemic, budgets across the board took a bit of a cut. We were very lucky in children's services that even though GRF funding was pulled back in some areas, other funding sources were used to backfill those allocations. And so essentially, the allocations that went out to county children's services agencies remained whole, and we are very grateful to the administration and to the department for that. So essentially, if you're comparing what actually went out to the counties versus the proposals in the next budget, we're really just seeing a 14% increase in terms of the comparison, rather than a 58%, because that larger figure takes into account the GRF that was pulled back due to the pandemic. We are a little saddened that that our best practices allocation was cut from $10 million to $5 million. And in fact, both of those, both the foster care recruitment and the best practices funding streams have been taken out of the state child protection allocation. And they will be subject to rule writing by the department. So it remains to be seen. Those won't be going out using the formula for the counties. Rather, they'll be held at the state, and determination will be made how they will be spent. So that's kind of the big myth that we wanted to dispel going into this, that Children's Services is not getting a 58% increase. We're getting a 14% increase. And let's talk a little bit about what that means. The good news in terms of allocations for Children's Services is that the SCPA, the state child protection allocation that we depend so heavily on to match those federal funds, has been maintained at $110 million a year. As Tara said, the multi-system youth funding line item has been maintained at $25 million a year. Now in the current biennium, $5 million of that was retained at the state level for statewide programming. $20 million went out to the counties. They had to share a portion of that with their Family and Children First councils, but they could use those funds to support our skyrocketing placement costs for multi-system youth, or to help prevent children from coming into care. Our Ohio Start program, which is one of the 5 prevention services that I mentioned earlier that we'll be launching with Family First, is in the budget at $4 million a year. There's some funding as well in the mental health and addiction services budget for Ohio Start. The Ohio Kinship and Adoption Navigator program, which was launched last year, has been maintained at $8.5 million. That's an amazing service that kinship caregivers and adoptive families who are struggling can call and be navigated to various services and resources. 30 Days to Family, which is a great program being used in a number of county children's services agencies to help identify kin as soon as children come in the door so that they don't have to be placed in foster care, has been maintained at $400,000. The Bridges program, which provides services to emancipated foster youth until they reach the age of 21, has been maintained at $8.7 million a year. Our enterprise document management system, which is a technology system that helps caseworkers be more efficient in the field, has been maintained. This figure, 11.8 million, is actually not just for children's services. It also applies to child support and income maintenance programs, all of the various JFS programs. And we're excited to see that those county costs have been maintained. And then programs for older youth and family stabilization have also been maintained at $3.2 million per year. So that's really good news for us. Again, we're very grateful to the governor for maintaining those funds in the executive budget at a time when we know that that with the pandemic, there's a lot of economic uncertainty. Also, in terms of good news, we are seeing new investments, and this comprises the 14% increase that we are seeing at in that line 523. The Kinship Support Program is a brand new program. It came out of the capital budget that passed at the end of last year. It sets aside $34.5 million during the first year of the biennium and $30 million during the second year of the biennium to stand up a new program that will provide some payments to families that have placement of children who are in Children's Services Agency custody. So oftentimes we place with a grandparent, with an aunt or uncle, with a family friend, and that kinship support is much better in the long run for children than being placed in stranger foster care. But we have not, in Ohio, provided a lot of financial support to those kin caregivers, and certainly not the level of support that foster caregivers receive. And there was a federal lawsuit in the 6th district, the federal 6th district, which covers Ohio, that came out in 2000. A decision came out in 2017 that says we really need to provide these kinship caregivers with the same level of support as foster caregivers. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this program because there's a lot of questions about whether this really satisfies the terms of the federal decision that applies to Ohio. But this is the state portion of 6 or 9 months, 9 months initially, backing off to 6 months down the road of support for kinship caregivers. They're receiving about $10.20 a day, which is equivalent to the OWF TANF child only payment, except they're receiving that for each child in their care. And during those 9 months at first, 6 months down the road, they'll have an opportunity to become licensed foster caregivers. And we'll talk about that part of the program in just a minute. There's some additional funding in there to support young adults, to ensure that we have a youth voice through the Ohio Youth Advisory Board in decision-making at the state level. And the Kinship Permanency Incentive Program has also been funded with $1 million in GRF, and then they have been backfilling that with TANF over the last I think 2 budgets. And so we still have yet to confirm how much is in the TANF budget for KPI. So the not so good news in terms of 523, we, as I mentioned earlier, are seeing some investment changes. That foster parent recruitment fund at $5 million and the best practices fund, which was reduced from 10 million to 5 million, will no longer be tied to the SCPA formula. Those rules will be written and the program administered at the state level. And then we have a number of new programs that have been funded not out of 523, but out of line 450, which is the program operations budget for ODJFS. Some of these come out of the Children's Services Transformation Advisory program. So we see an ombudsman program, which basically provides an opportunity for foster families or youth in the system who feel that that they're not being treated fairly or provided with ample services to contact somebody to resolve a complaint or a concern. Our Wendy's Wonderful Kids program is being expanded. That is a program that places child-focused adoption recruiters in agencies around the state. The state intends to set up a kinship guardianship assistance program that really won't take effect until the second year of the biennium. This is a very important program. We were concerned when the kinship support program was stood up because there really was no incentive then to move these kids who were in kinship placements into permanency. That's the goal of Children's Services, after all, is to make sure that kids have permanent legal relationships with families, not remain in agency foster care. And so the Kinship Guardianship Assistance Program provides some federal supports and state matching to families that take legal custody of kin. There's a little bit of money for prevention services, some funding to help move the Children's Services Transformation Advisory Report recommendations forward, a little bit more in the second year of the biennium, and then some funding for regional work. And this is all in, again, not in line 523, but in line 450, which is ODJFS operations. We're very grateful that the Independent Living Initiative has been maintained in the TANF budget. I think all of you are aware TANF federal funding earmarks have been made over time to support programs. They also support the Children's Trust Fund and the Ohio Fatherhood Commission. Our big concern about this budget is that the kinship caregiver program has been eliminated. This was a $15 million TANF earmark that we secured 2 budgets ago. This was our attempt to provide supports to kinship families that needed childcare payments, or maybe they needed to get a crib into their house when a baby suddenly came in. This was some flexible funding that JFS agencies were able to build into their PRC, prevention, retention, and contingency programs. this earmark has been eliminated, and we're concerned for a lot of different reasons. The argument, of course, is that they're standing up this new kinship support program, but the kinship caregiver program really offered some flexible funding for emergent needs. It allowed agencies to support families who had informal kinship arrangements that weren't involved with children's services, or who had legal custody or legal temporary custody of their kinship children, rather than that custody remaining with children's services. And so it was flexible in a way that the kinship support program is not. Our overall assessment of children's services funding is that while we're grateful for all of the funding that has been maintained, the trend that we're seeing is a little bit concerning. In a year when we have tremendous change on the horizon, tremendous and expensive change on the horizon, we're not seeing the investments in family first that we were hoping to see. We're seeing the kinship support program stood up, but all of the funding is dedicated to the statewide administration of the program for that first 9 or 6 months. Once those kin caregivers, if they choose to become licensed, their per diems will rise substantially from that TANF child only amount, and there's no funding in the budget to help support county agencies pay the non-federal share of those per diems. And we've seen a slight decrease in some of the county allocations, both the $10 million and the $15 million TANF that I mentioned, with an increase in statewide programming with no corresponding funding to support counties in carrying out these programs. So that's really, I think, driving our agenda for the budget, is to try to identify more funding that helps counties implement these important and critical changes that are going to be happening during this next biennium. In terms of policy changes, obviously, in addition to the fiscal stuff, there is a lot of language in the budget bill that affects children's services, probably more than we've seen in several budgets. And I've got a lot of slides that go into the weeds on these, but I won't take you through those. I'll spare you that unless somebody has some specific questions about policy. But not surprisingly, most of the policy language relates to the recommendations that came out of the governor's Children's Services Transformation Report at the end of last year. I've mentioned the Kinship Guardianship Assistance Program. Also in there, we plan to see a foster youth Bill of Rights, as well as a resource family or foster family Bill of Rights. We are seeing language that puts concurrent planning, which is a practice that many of our agencies use now, but it puts that into the revised code, as well as some intensive family finding language and some updates around the post-adoptive services funding that we use to support families who have adopted from foster care but may be struggling to continue with children who are experiencing trauma or mental illness issues as a result of what they faced in care. So those are some of the policy changes and language that we're seeing in the budget. I know this was a lot of detail, and I don't want to make your eyes cross too much longer. So Kelsey, I will turn it back over to you if we want to facilitate some conversation or field some questions.
Absolutely, Scott. Thank you so much for that review. I know I learned a lot. I know there's a lot of things changing specifically in these two issue areas. So I thank you for your time and for your thorough overview of what's happening in the budget. We know things can get messy sometimes. So I am taking a look at the chat. As of now, we don't have too many questions, or really any questions. You guys did a fantastic job in your presentations. So we will hang around for a few more minutes. Again, please feel free to submit your questions to the chat or to the Q&A function. Man, you blinded them with information.
Or maybe you put them to sleep. I don't know.
it is late morning. Maybe that second cup of coffee hasn't kicked in yet, but I found it incredibly helpful. And as always, these slides and and specifically, Scott, you mentioned your kind of more in-depth policy slides will be up and posted on AOF's website by noon today. So feel free to check it out, as well as the recordings and slides from all of our other webinars we've been doing. We will be back here on, March 12th for another budget policy webinar. We would love to hear from you as well for what you want to hear about, what you want to learn about in terms of what's happening in the budget. We do know that we're coming up on that first round of changes, of amendments to the budget that the House will be undergoing. They'll have that first sub-bill and then an omnibus amendment before it is voted out of the House. So lots of opportunities to change before then, but we'll keep you informed throughout the process.
Kelsey, there is a question about the Foster Youth Bill of Rights. Do you want me to answer that?
Yes, please.
So thanks, Allison, for that question. There already is some draft language for the Foster Youth Bill of Rights. I believe it was developed very closely in conjunction with our Ohio Youth Advisory Board. It's pretty good language as far as we're concerned. We've offered a couple of suggestions to it, but that language is moving forward. I'm not sure if there will be, I mean, obviously when it's put into rule, that's when there will be an opportunity for public comment. The interesting thing, I think the very logical thing is that when there is a dispute, it's going to be written into the rule, I believe. When there is a dispute between the youth rights and the foster parent rights, the youth rights will take precedence over the foster parent rights. So that was an interesting piece to come out of the development of those Bill of Rights.
Great, thank you, Scott. All right, looking at that chat box, no additional questions so far. I wanted to once more reiterate, we did get confirmation from Representative Romer's office that next week will be the very last chance to submit public testimony to the budget in the House process. So make sure that you connect with the chair's office. We do know that they are inviting different agency directors for different days. I believe the intention is to have that testimony submitted under the appropriate or aligned agency. I know with AOF being kind of a jack of all trades, we will be submitting our testimony as soon as possible. But just wanted to clarify and make sure that we continue to send out the message that next week is that last chance to submit public testimony to the budget in the House.
One more question from Allison.
Fantastic.
She asks, where will the Youth Ombudsman Program live? That's a really good question. There was a lot of testimony. If you attended any of the regional meetings that the Children's Services Transformation Advisory Council hosted, gosh, they wrapped those up, I think, in January or February of last year, and they had taken place sort of over the holidays in 2019. A lot of folks said that the Ombudsman Program needs to remain independent and live outside of ODJFS, or that at least a very clear wall needs to be built between ODJFS administration and the Ombudsman Program. It's not yet clear to us whether that program will live at ODJFS or will go somewhere like the Attorney General's office, which was one of the suggestions during those regional meetings. So stay tuned. We're eager to learn the answer to that question as well.
Great, thank you, Scott. I noticed Tara's answered some questions in the Q&A function as well, so thank you so much, Tara. All right, folks, that may do it for this morning. I want to thank our presenters for their time and expertise on these issues today. Incredibly important. I know I learned a lot. Again, we will be back with you on March 12th with another opportunity to learn about the budget as proposed and for additional updates on the process. I want to thank you for your time. Feel free to revisit the webinar at advocates4ohio.org/webinars, and we will see you again soon. Have a great rest of your day. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe.
Thank you.
You're welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Kelsey.
You're welcome, Scott. Thank you so much.
Oh, I hope it wasn't too much detail.
Oh, Never. We love this stuff. We live for it. Have a
Very good. Have a great